The autumn wind carried dust through the main street of Redemption Springs, a town that had grown fat on silver mines and cattle drives since the war's end. The Golden Spur Saloon stood at the corner of Main and Prospect, its painted sign faded by 10 years of unforgiving sun. Inside, the afternoon light slanted through windows clouded with tobacco smoke, illuminating specks of dust that danced above tables where men nursed whiskey and spoke in low voices about ore prices and the coming winter. Behind the bar, Clara Thornton wiped glasses with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and precise, honed by 7 years of serving drinks to miners, cowboys, and drifters who passed through this corner of Montana territory. She had learned to read men's intentions in the set of their shoulders, the way their hands rested near their guns, the stories their eyes told when whiskey loosened their tongues. At 28, she had seen enough of human nature to fill several lifetimes. Yet something about the quiet stranger who had been occupying the corner table for 3 days running caught her attention in a way she couldn't quite explain. Before we continue with Clara's story, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying these tales from the Old West. We share stories of courage, justice, and life on the frontier. The stranger called himself simply Webb, offering no first name, no history, no explanation for his presence, beyond a polite tip of his weathered hat and a request for coffee, black as midnight. He dressed like any cowpuncher, canvas trousers worn smooth at the knees, a shirt that had seen better days, boots that had walked considerable miles, and a gun belt that showed the kind of wear that spoke of familiarity rather than showmanship. His revolver, a well-maintained Colt, sat in its holster with the ease of a tool rather than a trophy. Clara noticed that he never sat with his back to the door, that his eyes tracked every entrance and exit, that he spoke rarely but listened constantly. There was something in the way he carried himself, a quiet authority that suggested he had commanded respect in places far from this smoky saloon. When he looked at Clara, his gaze held neither the hungry assessment of most men, nor the dismissive indifference some showed to women in her profession, but rather a kind of respectful acknowledgement, as if he recognized in her the same weary competence he carried in himself. On the 4th evening of Webb's presence, a commotion at the bar drew Clara's attention. 3 drovers from the Circle K ranch had been drinking since noon, their voices growing louder with each round, their gestures more expansive and aggressive. The youngest, barely 20, with more whiskey than sense in his blood, had taken to making remarks about Clara that grew progressively more crude as the afternoon wore into evening. She had weathered such talk before. It came with the territory. But there was something particularly nasty in this boy's tone, a meanness that spoke of a character formed by cruelty and unchecked privilege. His companions laughed and encouraged him, their own judgment clouded by liquor and the pack mentality that turned otherwise decent men into bullies. Clara continued her work, ignoring the comments with the practiced detachment of someone who had learned that engaging with such behavior only encouraged it. But when the young drover reached across the bar and grabbed her wrist with enough force to leave marks, everything changed. Webb moved with a speed that belied his seemingly relaxed posture. One moment he was seated at his corner table. The next he stood beside the young drover, his hand wrapped around the boy's forearm, with a grit that made the cowboy's face go white. "The lady doesn't care for your attention," Webb said quietly. his voice carrying the kind of authority that made every conversation in the saloon stop. His tone was conversational, almost friendly, but there was steel underneath it. The unmistakable sound of a man who had delivered final warnings before. The young drover tried to pull away, then tried to swing at Webb with his free hand, but found himself suddenly bent over the bar, his arm twisted at an angle that promised considerable pain if he resisted further. Webb's movements had been economical, practiced, the kind of physical control that came from years of handling violent men. "You're going to apologize to Miss Thornton," Webb continued in that same quiet voice. "Then you and your friends are going to settle your tab and leave. You'll find other places to drink for the next month or so until you've learned some manners." The drover's companions started to rise, hands moving toward their guns. But something in Webb's eyes stopped them. Clara had seen many kinds of danger in her years behind the bar. The wild, unpredictable violence of men who killed without thinking. The cold brutality of those who enjoyed inflicting pain. What she saw in Webb's gaze was different. A calm certainty. The look of a man who had walked through fire and emerged on the other side. Who knew exactly what he was capable of and felt no need to prove it. The young drover mumbled an apology through gritted teeth, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. Webb released him slowly, stepping back, but keeping himself positioned between the drovers and Clara. The three men paid their tab and left, the youngest casting murderous looks over his shoulder, but they left nonetheless. The saloon gradually returned to its usual noise level, though Clara noticed several patrons regarding Webb with new interest, the kind of speculation that came when men recognized a dangerous competence in their midst. That night, after the last customers had stumbled out into the darkness, and Clara was tallying the day's receipts, she found a leather pouch on the bar where Webb had been sitting. Inside was more gold than she had seen in one place since before the war. Double eagles and half eagles, the coins heavy and substantial, along with a small bag of gold dust that spoke of recent mining activity. A note, written in an educated hand that surprised her, accompanied the gold. "For your trouble, and for your grace under difficult circumstances. The world needs more people who maintain their dignity when others abandon theirs. May this help you build whatever future you're hoping for. W." Clara stared at the gold, then at the note, her mind racing through possibilities. This was more than a generous tip. It was life-changing money, enough to buy property, start a business, escape the saloon life that had trapped her since her father's death left her orphaned and destitute. Webb had already left, disappeared into the night as quietly as he had arrived, offering this extraordinary gift with no expectation of gratitude or acknowledgement. The next morning, Clara asked around about Webb, trying to understand who this mysterious benefactor might be. Old Pete, who ran the livery stable and knew everyone's business, recalled that Webb had ridden in on a fine roan gelding, the kind of horse that cost serious money. The blacksmith mentioned that Webb had paid for new shoes for his mount with gold dust, the same kind found in the Northern Territories where the richest strikes were still being made. But nobody seemed to know where Webb came from or where he had gone, only that he had appeared, dealt with the troublesome drovers, left his extraordinary gift, and vanished like smoke in wind. Clara found herself thinking about the stranger at odd moments, wondering about the story behind those tired eyes, the source of that quiet authority, the reason a man would give away a fortune to a saloon girl he had known for less than a week. She carefully hid the gold, telling no one about it, sensing that discretion was important, even if she didn't fully understand why. 3 weeks passed. Clara continued her work at the Golden Spur, but her mind was elsewhere, calculating possibilities, imagining futures that had seemed impossible just a month before. She had begun making discreet inquiries about purchasing the small hotel on the edge of town, a property that could be converted into a respectable boarding house for the teachers and merchants who were beginning to arrive as Redemption Springs grew more civilized. The gold Webb had left her would cover the purchase price and renovations, with enough left over to operate for a year while she established her business. For the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to hope, to see beyond the endless cycle of serving drinks and deflecting unwanted advances. She thought often of Webb, wondering where he had gone, whether he had any idea how profoundly his gift had changed her trajectory. Part of her wanted to thank him, to tell him what his generosity meant. But a larger part understood that he had given his gift with no expectation of recognition or gratitude, that acknowledging it might somehow diminish what he had offered. On a Tuesday morning, when the autumn chill had given way to the first real cold of winter, Redemption Springs received an unusual visitor. A carriage arrived at the Grand Hotel, far finer than anything the town usually saw. A black lacquered coach with silver fittings, drawn by 4 matched horses that spoke of considerable wealth. The passenger who emerged wore a suit that cost more than most men in Redemption Springs earned in a year. A gold watch chain stretched across his vest, and an expression of concentrated determination. Mayor Henderson, who had been enjoying his morning coffee at the hotel restaurant, nearly choked when he recognized the visitor. This was Thomas Blackwell, mayor of Helena, and one of the most powerful men in Montana Territory. A man whose mining interests had made him wealthy beyond most people's comprehension. Blackwell's arrival set the town buzzing with speculation. Men of his stature didn't visit places like Redemption Springs without significant reason. Mayor Henderson scrambled to present himself properly, wondering what crisis or opportunity had brought such an important figure to their modest community. Blackwell's first question surprised everyone. "I'm looking for a man who may have passed through here recently. Tall, perhaps 50 years old, quiet demeanor, traveling alone on a roan gelding. He might have called himself Webb, or possibly used another name. It's imperative that I find him. He's done something extraordinarily foolish, and I need to make it right before he disappears completely." Mayor Henderson and his assembled council members exchanged glances, recognizing the description, but uncertain about what Blackwell's interest might mean. The mayor, a cautious man who had survived frontier politics by learning when to speak and when to listen, suggested they discuss the matter privately. In his office, Blackwell revealed a story that explained much and raised even more questions. Webb was actually William Blackwell, Thomas's younger brother, a man who had made his own fortune in the northern goldfields and had recently decided to give away his entire wealth before retiring to some remote corner of the territory where he could live out his remaining years in peace and anonymity. "My brother," Thomas Blackwell explained, his voice carrying a mixture of exasperation and deep affection, "has always been the most frustratingly principled man I've ever known. He fought in the war, came west with nothing, built a mining operation that made him wealthier than our father ever dreamed of being. But he never cared about the money. It was the work that mattered to him. The challenge of wresting gold from stubborn earth. The satisfaction of building something substantial. 6 months ago, he told me he was done, that he'd made enough money for 10 lifetimes and intended to give it away to people who needed it more than he did. I thought he was joking, or going through some temporary crisis. I should have known better. Thomas paused, looking out the window at the rough street, the modest buildings, the frontier town that represented everything his brother had always preferred to the polished society of Helena. William started traveling, quietly visiting small towns, observing people, looking for those he considered deserving. He's already given away hundreds of thousands of dollars to people he's never met, asking nothing in return, not even acknowledgement. Mayor Henderson listened with growing amazement, understanding now what had transpired in his town. "There's a woman," he said carefully, "who works at the Golden Spur Saloon, a good woman, respectable despite her employment, who's been asking about property purchases lately. She matches your timeline. Webb, or William, was here about 3 weeks ago. There was an incident where he intervened to protect her from some troublesome cowboys. If your brother was looking for someone deserving, Clara Thornton would certainly qualify." Thomas Blackwell's expression softened. "That sounds exactly like something William would do. The man has an infallible instinct for recognizing genuine character. But I need to find him, not to stop his generosity, but to make sure he keeps enough to live on. He's given away so much that I'm concerned he'll leave himself destitute. And he's too stubborn to accept help once he's decided on a course of action." Did he mention where he was heading? The search for information led inevitably to Clara. Mayor Henderson and Thomas Blackwell arrived at the Golden Spur during the afternoon lull, when only a handful of regular customers nursed drinks and played desultory hands of cards. Clara looked up from her inventory, immediately sensing that something significant was happening. The mayor made introductions, and Thomas Blackwell studied Clara with the same assessing gaze his brother had shown. Though Thomas's evaluation carried more calculation, the practiced judgment of a businessman, weighing investments and returns. "Miss Thornton," Thomas began formally, "I believe my brother William spent some time in your establishment recently. He may have called himself Webb. I'm trying to locate him on a matter of considerable importance." Clara felt her chest tighten, suddenly fearful that Webb's gift had been some kind of mistake, that this wealthy man had come to reclaim the gold. She remained silent, her expression carefully neutral, the protective wariness of someone who had learned not to volunteer information until she understood the full situation. Thomas seemed to read her concern. "Please understand, Miss Thornton, I'm not here to take back anything William gave you. My brother's gifts are his to give, and his judgment in such matters has always been impeccable. I simply need to find him before he gives away so much that he leaves himself with nothing. He's done this before, become so focused on helping others that he forgets to ensure his own future security. I want to make certain he retains enough to live comfortably for his remaining years." The sincerity in Thomas's voice convinced Clara of his genuine concern. She described Webb's departure, mentioned that he had paid the livery stable for 2 weeks' board for his horse before leaving, suggesting he might not have gone far initially. Old Pete at the livery recalled Webb asking about remote valleys to the north, places where a man could build a cabin and live quietly, away from the complications of civilization. Thomas absorbed this information with a mixture of resignation and determination, understanding that his brother had likely already moved on to his next destination, distributing his fortune to those he deemed worthy along the way. Before leaving, Thomas Blackwell turned to Clara with an expression of genuine warmth. Miss Thornton, my brother clearly saw something exceptional in you. William has always had an uncanny ability to recognize character. It served him well in business and in life. Whatever he gave you, he meant for you to have it, to build the life you deserve. I hope you'll use it wisely and remember that genuine generosity, the kind that expects nothing in return, is perhaps the rarest quality in this world. He paused, then added, "If you should happen to see William again, would you tell him that his brother loves him, worries about him, and respects his choices even when they're completely insane?" Clara promised she would, though she suspected the chances of seeing Webb again were minimal. A man who gave away fortunes anonymously and then disappeared into the wilderness was not someone who intended to be found or recognized. That evening, after Thomas Blackwell had departed in his fine carriage and Redemption Springs had returned to its usual rhythms, Clara stood behind her bar and reflected on the extraordinary sequence of events. She thought about Webb, William Blackwell, and the quiet dignity with which he had moved through the world, helping others without seeking recognition or gratitude. She thought about the fortune he had given her, life-changing money that represented not just gold, but belief in her worth, in her potential to be more than circumstances had allowed. The weight of that gift, the responsibility of honoring the trust he had placed in her, settled on her shoulders with surprising comfort. She had been given not just money, but possibility, the chance to build something meaningful, to create a life of purpose and independence. In a frontier where second chances were rare and women's options limited, Webb's gift represented a kind of freedom that money alone couldn't purchase. It was belief, translated into gold, that she was capable of more than serving whiskey to rough men in a smoky saloon. Clara began making arrangements to purchase the small hotel, working with the town's lawyer to ensure everything was legal and proper. She hired craftsmen to begin renovations, transforming the somewhat shabby building into a respectable establishment that would cater to the growing number of families and legitimate business people arriving as Redemption Springs evolved from rough mining camp to actual town. She named it the Blackwell House, a small acknowledgement of the man whose generosity had made everything possible, knowing that Webb would probably never know about the honor, but wanting to remember him nonetheless. The work was hard, demanding skills she had to learn quickly, but Clara discovered she had a talent for hospitality that went beyond serving drinks. She created a place where travelers felt welcomed, where families could stay comfortably, where the emerging civilization of the West found a foothold in a community still rough around the edges. 6 months after Webb's departure, Clara stood on the newly painted porch of the Blackwell House, watching the spring sun set over the mountains that ringed Redemption Springs. Her boarding house was thriving, hosting the new school teacher, several merchants establishing businesses in town, and a young doctor who had just arrived to open the community's first proper medical practice. She had hired 2 other women from the saloon, giving them the same kind of opportunity Webb had given her, understanding that generosity multiplied itself when it was shared rather than hoarded. The Golden Spur still operated, but Clara no longer worked there. She had moved beyond that chapter of her life, while maintaining respect for the people still earning their livings behind those smoke-stained walls. She thought often of Webb, wondering where he was, whether he was safe, whether he had found the peace he seemed to be seeking in those remote valleys to the north. In the years that followed, Clara occasionally heard stories that might have been about Webb, tales of a quiet stranger who appeared in small towns, observed people carefully, and sometimes left extraordinary gifts for those he deemed deserving. A widow in Virginia City who found enough gold to save her ranch after her husband died in a mining accident. An elderly couple in Bannock who discovered they could finally retire after a mysterious benefactor paid off their debts. A young man in Butte who received the funds needed to attend medical school back east. The stories had a similar pattern. A quiet observer, a moment of genuine need or deserving character, a life-changing gift given anonymously, and then disappearance. Clara never knew for certain if these stories involved Webb, but she liked to think they did. That somewhere in the vast territories of the West, William Blackwell continued his quiet mission of recognizing worth and rewarding it without expectation of recognition or return. The Blackwell House became one of the most respected establishments in Redemption Springs, known not just for comfortable accommodations, but for Clara's insistence on treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. She developed a reputation for giving young women opportunities, for offering second chances to those society had written off, for maintaining standards of decency without judgment or self-righteousness. Travelers who stayed at the Blackwell House often remarked on the atmosphere of genuine hospitality, the sense that they were valued as individuals rather than just paying customers. Clara never told anyone the full story of how she had acquired the property, maintaining Webb's anonymity, even as she honored his memory through her actions. She understood that his gift had been more than money. It had been belief in her potential, recognition of her character, and trust that she would use the opportunity wisely. 10 years after Webb's visit, Thomas Blackwell returned to Redemption Springs. He had aged considerably, his hair now completely gray, his face lined with the cares of managing a business empire and worrying about his missing brother. Clara welcomed him to the Blackwell House, offering him the best room and insisting he stay as her guest. Over dinner in her private quarters, Thomas revealed that he had never found William, despite years of searching and following rumors of the mysterious benefactor who appeared and disappeared like a ghost. My brother always said that true generosity required anonymity, Thomas explained, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had finally accepted what he could not change. He believed that once recognition or gratitude entered the equation, the purity of the gift was compromised. I think he's alive, probably living quietly in some remote valley, content with having helped people he'll never see again. It's maddening, but it's also beautiful in its own way. Clara understood. She had built a life on the foundation of Webb's gift, not just the gold he had left, but the belief he had shown in her worth and potential. She had learned that genuine generosity was indeed its own reward, that helping others without expectation of return created a kind of satisfaction that recognition could never provide. The Blackwell House stood as a testament to what one person's faith in another could accomplish, how a moment of recognition and support could change not just one life, but ripple outward to affect entire communities. She thought of Webb out there somewhere, living simply, perhaps still quietly observing people, and occasionally changing lives with his extraordinary gifts, content in his anonymity, and satisfied with the knowledge that he had made a difference even if no one knew his name. On quiet evenings, when the last guests had retired, and Clara sat on her porch, watching the stars emerge over the mountains, she sometimes allowed herself to remember that afternoon, when Webb had defended her dignity, the note he had left with his gift, the quiet recognition that had meant more than the gold itself. She had learned from his example that worth wasn't measured by what others thought of you, but by how you treated people when no one was watching, when there was no advantage to be gained from kindness. The frontier was still rough, still dangerous, still unforgiving in many ways. But people like Webb, like William Blackwell, proved that even in the harsh realities of the West, grace and generosity could flourish. Clara had taken his gift and multiplied it, creating opportunities for others, building something that would outlast her own lifetime, ensuring that Webb's moment of recognition would continue to affect lives long after everyone involved had returned to dust. The wind continued to blow through Redemption Springs, carrying dust and possibility, hardship and hope. The town evolved, growing more civilized while never quite losing its frontier edge. The Blackwell House stood at the corner of Main and Prospect, a testament to one man's quiet generosity and one woman's determination to honor that gift by paying it forward. Clara Thornton, once a saloon girl with limited options and diminishing hope, had become a respected businesswoman and pillar of her community, not because someone had rescued her, but because someone had recognized her worth and given her the tools to rescue herself. And somewhere in the vast territories of the West, a quiet man who had once been called Webb continued his journey, seeking those whose character deserved recognition, whose potential required only opportunity, whose lives could be changed by belief translated into gold. The seasons turned with their usual indifference to human affairs, and the Blackwell House continued to prosper under Clara's management. She had hired Martha Simmons, a widow whose husband had died in a mining accident, to help with the daily operations. Martha brought her 2 daughters with her, young women of 16 and 18 who found honest work in the boarding house instead of the more questionable employment that often awaited women in frontier towns. Clara watched these girls with particular attention, remembering her own younger self, the limited choices she had faced, the desperation that had led her to work in the Golden Spur. She paid them fair wages, taught them bookkeeping and hospitality, and ensured they understood they had options beyond marriage or servitude. In this way, Webb's gift continued to multiply, creating opportunities that extended beyond the original recipient to touch lives he would never know about. Winter arrived with unusual ferocity that year, bringing snow that piled higher than anyone could remember, temperatures that froze the water in the town's wells, and winds that howled through the streets like wounded animals. The Blackwell House became a refuge for travelers caught in the storms, and Clara found herself extending credit to those who couldn't pay, feeding people who had nothing to offer in return, demonstrating the same kind of generosity Webb had shown her. She understood now that his gift had been more than gold. It had been an example, a lesson in how one person's actions could create ripples that extended far beyond the original gesture. During those brutal winter months, Clara kept the fireplaces burning day and night, ensured that no one was turned away from her door, and discovered that the satisfaction of helping others created a warmth that transcended physical comfort. One particularly harsh evening in February, a man arrived at the Blackwell House, nearly frozen, his horse barely able to stand, both of them covered in ice and snow. Clara and Martha helped him inside, got him near the fire, and sent for Doc Hensley. The stranger was perhaps 40 years old, with the weathered face of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors, and hands that bore the calluses of hard work. As he thawed and recovered, he introduced himself as Samuel Crawford, a former cavalry scout who had been traveling to Butte when the storm caught him. He had heard about Redemption Springs from other travelers, particularly about the Blackwell house and the woman who ran it with such grace and generosity. "They say you treat people decent," Samuel said, his voice still rough from the cold. "Said you give folks a fair shake regardless of their circumstances. That's rare in this country, rare enough to be worth noting." Samuel stayed at the Blackwell house for 2 weeks while the storms raged and the passes remained impassable. During that time, Clara learned his story. He had served in the cavalry during the Indian Wars, a duty that had left him with complicated feelings about the violence he had participated in and witnessed. After mustering out, he had worked as a scout for the railroad, then as a hunting guide, always searching for something he couldn't quite name, some sense of purpose or peace that eluded him. He spoke of the country he had seen, the vast distances of the West, the places where a man could ride for weeks without seeing another human being. In his descriptions, Clara heard echoes of what Webb might have been seeking, that sense of space and solitude. The freedom to be anonymous in a land too large for reputation or history to follow. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace after the other guests had retired, Samuel mentioned a remote valley he had discovered while scouting in the Northern Territories. "Most beautiful place I've ever seen," he said, gazing into the flames with the distant look of someone remembering something precious. "Protected by mountains on 3 sides, with a stream that runs year-round and meadows that stay green through most of the summer. There was a cabin there, newly built, well made by someone who knew what they were doing. Saw smoke from the chimney, but never saw the person living there. Respected their privacy. A man doesn't build in a place like that unless he wants to be left alone." Clara's heart quickened. She asked careful questions about the location, the timing, whether Samuel had noticed anything else about the cabin or its occupant. The valley he described was northwest of Helena, accessible only through difficult mountain passes, exactly the kind of place Webb might have chosen for his retreat from the world. Samuel noticed Clara's interest. "You know someone who might be living out that way?" he asked. Clara hesitated, then told him an abbreviated version of Webb's story. The mysterious stranger who had helped her, the extraordinary gift that had changed her life, the brother who had come searching but never found him. She didn't mention the full extent of Webb's wealth or his campaign to give it away, respecting the privacy he had so clearly valued. Samuel listened thoughtfully, then nodded. "Sounds like a man who's earned his peace. The West is full of people running from something or toward something else. Maybe your friend Webb found what he was looking for in that valley. Sometimes a man needs to step away from the world to remember who he is underneath all the roles and expectations." The storms eventually broke, and Samuel continued his journey to Butte. Before leaving, he drew Clara a detailed map of how to reach the valley he had described, though he cautioned her about the difficulty of the journey and the harshness of the terrain. "If you decide to go looking," he said, "wait until late spring or early summer. Those mountain passes are deadly in winter, and even in good weather, you'll need someone who knows the country to guide you. But if that man gave you what you say he did, maybe you're owed the chance to tell him what it meant." Clara accepted the map, folded it carefully, and placed it in the strongbox where she kept her most valuable documents. She wasn't certain she would ever use it. Part of her understood that Webb's anonymity was intentional, that seeking him out might violate the spirit of his gift. But having the map, knowing where he might be, provided a strange comfort, a connection to the man who had so profoundly altered her trajectory. Spring arrived with its usual drama. Snow melting to reveal the earth beneath, streams swelling to rivers, and the mountain passes slowly becoming navigable again. The town came alive with renewed energy as miners returned to their claims. Cattle drives began moving north, and the railroad pushed ever closer to Redemption Springs. Clara's boarding house filled with surveyors, engineers, and businessmen who saw opportunity in the changing landscape. She found herself at the center of the town's commercial life, privy to plans and schemes, aware of which ventures would likely succeed and which were doomed to failure. Her judgment, honed by years of observing human nature in the saloon, served her well in this new capacity. She began investing cautiously, purchasing small properties, partnering with reliable people on ventures that would benefit the community. The gold Webb had given her continued to multiply, not through greed, but through careful stewardship and a genuine desire to see Redemption Springs prosper. In late May, a letter arrived at the Blackwell house, addressed to Clara. The handwriting was educated and elegant, belonging to someone who had received considerable schooling. The return address showed it came from San Francisco, from a lawyer's office. Clara opened it with curiosity mixed with trepidation, wondering what business a San Francisco lawyer could possibly have with her. The letter's contents stunned her. It was from the law firm representing the estate of William Blackwell, informing her that she had been named as a beneficiary in his will. The letter didn't state that William had died. In fact, it explicitly noted that he was very much alive, but rather that he had established a trust that would provide annual disbursements to certain individuals he had helped during his travels. Clara was to receive $200 per year for the rest of her life. No strings attached, no obligations required, simply a continuation of the generosity he had already shown her. The letter included a brief note, written in William's own hand, that Clara recognized from the message he had left with the original gold. "Miss Thornton," it read, "I trust you have used your opportunities wisely and built something meaningful. The annual sum provided by this trust is not because you need it, but rather as a reminder that your worth was recognized and your character valued. Use it as you see fit, for yourself, for others, or for causes you believe in. Know that your grace and dignity in difficult circumstances made an impression on someone who has seen much of human nature at its worst and best. Continue to be the kind of person who makes the world slightly better by existing in it. With respect and admiration, William Blackwell." Clara read the note multiple times, her eyes filling with tears that she didn't bother to hide. It wasn't the money that moved her. $200 annually was helpful, but not life-changing, given the success of her boarding house. It was the message itself, the recognition that Webb had understood exactly what he was doing when he gave her that first gift, that he had believed she would use it wisely and had been proven correct. The fact that he had taken the time to establish a trust, to ensure ongoing support, even though she no longer needed it for survival, spoke to a level of thoughtfulness and care that transcended simple generosity. He had seen her not as a project or charity case, but as someone whose potential deserved nurturing, whose character merited acknowledgement. Clara placed the letter in her strongbox alongside Samuel's map, two tangible connections to the man who had altered her life's trajectory without asking anything in return. Summer brought its own challenges and opportunities. The railroad finally reached Redemption Springs, transforming the town overnight from a relatively isolated community into a hub of commerce and activity. New businesses opened along Main Street, and the population nearly doubled within months. Clara found herself hosting railroad executives, mining investors, and entrepreneurs who saw opportunity in the changing landscape. The Blackwell House's reputation for cleanliness, good food, and respectful hospitality made it the preferred accommodation for the more respectable class of newcomer. Clara hired additional staff, including a young man named Jacob Turner, who had arrived from Ohio with hopes of making his fortune, but had discovered that success required more than ambition. She recognized in Jacob the same kind of determination tempered by humility that she had seen in herself years before, and she offered him a position managing the day-to-day operations of the boarding house. Jacob proved remarkably capable, and Clara found herself with more time to consider the map Samuel had drawn. The anniversary of Webb's first visit to Redemption Springs had passed. It had been nearly 2 years since that afternoon when he had defended her dignity in the saloon. 2 years since the gift that had changed everything. She felt a growing certainty that she needed to make the journey Samuel had described, not to disturb Webb's solitude or demand acknowledgement, but simply to deliver her thanks in person and let him see what his generosity had accomplished. Clara spent weeks planning the expedition, consulting with experienced guides, purchasing proper equipment, and ensuring the Blackwell House would be in capable hands during her absence. Martha and Jacob both tried to dissuade her, citing the dangers of mountain travel and the questionable wisdom of seeking out someone who had clearly chosen isolation. But Clara remained determined. In early July, Clara set out with a guide named Henry Moss, a grizzled former trapper who knew the Northern Territories better than most men knew their own properties. They traveled on horseback, carrying supplies for 2 weeks, following Samuel's map through increasingly remote and rugged country. Henry maintained a running commentary about the dangers they faced: bears, mountain lions, sudden weather changes, treacherous trails. But Clara noticed he seemed to relish the journey, pleased to be back in the wilderness he clearly loved. They climbed through passes where the air grew thin and cold even in summer, descended into valleys where wildflowers carpeted meadows in impossible colors, and forded streams swollen with snowmelt that could sweep away horse and rider if not crossed carefully. The journey tested Clara's endurance in ways she hadn't anticipated, but she discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. On the 9th day of their journey, they reached the valley Samuel had described. It was everything he had promised and more, a hidden paradise protected by steep mountain walls, with a crystalline stream running through its center, and meadows that seemed to glow green in the afternoon sunlight. Henry pointed toward the far end of the valley, where smoke rose from the chimney of a well-built log cabin situated against the tree line. "Someone's home," he said quietly. "Question is whether they want visitors." Clara felt her heart pounding as they approached slowly, giving the cabin's occupant plenty of time to see them coming. A man emerged from the cabin as they drew near, and Clara immediately recognized him, despite 2 years of aging and the fuller beard he now wore. Webb William Blackwell stood on his porch with a rifle cradled in his arms, not threatening, but cautious, the stance of someone accustomed to evaluating strangers. Recognition dawned in William's eyes as they got closer. Clara saw surprise, then what might have been pleasure, followed quickly by concern. Henry, reading the situation with a lifetime's experience, announced that he would make camp by the stream and give them privacy. William lowered his rifle and stepped down from the porch, his weathered face showing the same quiet dignity Clara remembered. "Miss Thornton," he said, his voice exactly as she recalled, calm, measured, respectful. "This is unexpected. I trust everything is well in Redemption Springs?" Clara dismounted, suddenly uncertain how to explain why she had traveled so far to find a man who had clearly sought to remain unfound. But William's expression held no anger or annoyance, only patient curiosity, as if he understood that people sometimes needed to complete circles they had begun. They sat on William's porch as the afternoon lengthened toward evening, and Clara told him everything. How his gift had enabled her to purchase and renovate the boarding house. How she had named it the Blackwell House in his honor. How she had tried to emulate his generosity by helping others as he had helped her. She showed him the recent letter from his lawyer, thanked him for the trust he had established, and explained that she hadn't come to ask for anything more, but simply to let him see the results of his faith in her character. William listened without interrupting, his blue eyes fixed on the distant mountains, occasionally nodding, but mostly just absorbing her words. When she finished, silence settled between them, comfortable rather than awkward. Two people who understood that some moments required no immediate response. "I'm glad," William finally said, his voice carrying genuine warmth. "When I give these gifts, I never know what becomes of them. I choose people based on what I observe of their character, their resilience, their treatment of others when they think no one important is watching. But I never stay to see whether my judgment was sound, whether the opportunity was used well or squandered. Knowing that you built something meaningful, that you've helped others in turn, it confirms that the giving was worthwhile." He paused, then added, "My brother Thomas found you, I assume? He told you who I was?" Clara confirmed that Thomas had indeed come looking for William, explaining his concern about his brother's welfare. William smiled slightly. "Thomas has always been a worrier. He thinks I'm impoverishing myself with this campaign of giving. He doesn't understand that I have more than enough, that I've simplified my life to the point where I need very little, that the satisfaction of helping others provides more happiness than accumulating wealth ever did." Clara asked William about his life in the valley, and he described his daily routine with evident contentment. He hunted and fished for food, tended a small garden, read extensively from the books he had brought with him, and spent hours simply observing the natural world around him. "For the first time in my adult life," he explained, "I'm not responsible for payrolls, operations, profits, losses, or the 100 other concerns that come with business. I'm just a man living in a beautiful valley, bothering no one, enjoying the simple fact of existence." The war taught me that life is fragile and often brutally short. I spent 20 years building wealth because I was good at it, and it gave me purpose. Now, I'm spending my remaining years giving that wealth away and living simply, because that also gives me purpose. Perhaps even more profoundly. As evening approached, Clara understood it was time to leave. She hadn't come to intrude on William's chosen solitude, only to close the circle their brief encounter had opened. Before departing, she asked one final question. "Do you have regrets about giving away your fortune? Do you ever wish you had kept more for yourself?" William considered the question seriously, then shook his head. "I kept enough to ensure I'll never be a burden to anyone." The trust provides for a dozen people who impressed me during my travels. People like you who demonstrated character worth acknowledging. My cabin is paid for. I have funds to purchase supplies when needed, and I own mineral rights that will provide income for my lifetime should I need it. Beyond that, what would I do with the money? Build a bigger house in this remote valley where no one would see it? Purchase possessions I don't need? Hire servants to do work I enjoy doing myself? He walked with Clara to where Henry had made camp, and the three of them shared a simple meal around the campfire. Henry and William discovered they knew some of the same places and people, the kind of small connections that linked men who had spent years in the West's vast spaces. As darkness settled and stars emerged in impossible profusion, William told stories of the people he had helped during his travels. The widow who had saved her ranch, the elderly couple who could finally retire in dignity, the young man who had become a doctor. Clara realized that these stories were William's treasure now, the return on his investment in human potential. He didn't need gratitude or recognition, but knowing that his gifts had enabled genuine transformation provided satisfaction deeper than any profit margin or bank balance. In the morning, Clara and Henry prepared to depart. William stood on his porch, watching them ready their horses, and Clara noticed he seemed more at peace than anyone she had ever encountered. Before mounting her horse, she turned to him one final time. "Thank you," she said simply, "not just for the gold, but for seeing something in me that I hadn't fully seen in myself." William nodded, a slight smile touching his weathered face. "You already possessed everything necessary: character, resilience, intelligence, grace. I simply provided opportunity. What you built from that opportunity was entirely your own accomplishment. Continue doing good work, Miss Thornton. The world needs more people like you." The journey back to Redemption Springs seemed shorter than the journey out, perhaps because Clara's purpose had been fulfilled. She and Henry made good time, encountering no serious difficulties, and arrived in town 12 days after departing. The Blackwell house had run smoothly in her absence, and Clara settled back into her routines with a sense of completion. She never told anyone except Martha and Jacob about finding William, respecting his privacy as he had respected her dignity. But the journey had given her something valuable: confirmation that generosity genuinely given without expectation of return created ripples that extended far beyond the original gift. That recognizing worth in others and providing them with opportunity was perhaps the most meaningful investment anyone could make. Years continued to pass. The Blackwell House became an institution in Redemption Springs, known throughout Montana Territory for its quality and the character of its owner. Clara never married, finding fulfillment in her work and in the community she had helped build. She continued receiving the annual disbursements from William's Trust and used them to establish a fund that provided small loans to women. She called it the Webb Fund, using the name William had traveled under, and it helped dozens of women over the years, each of them receiving not just money but belief in their potential. Clara served on the town council, helped establish a proper school, and became a voice for progressive causes: women's suffrage, workers' rights, education for all children, regardless of background. She wielded the influence William's gift had enabled with the same thoughtfulness he had shown in giving it. In 1889, when Montana achieved statehood, Clara attended the celebration in Helena as a representative of Redemption Springs. She was now 45 years old, successful, respected, and influential in ways that would have seemed impossible during her years serving drinks in the Golden Spur Saloon. During the celebration, she encountered Thomas Blackwell, now in his 60s and still one of Montana's most prominent citizens. They spoke briefly, and Thomas mentioned that William was still living in his remote valley, now approaching 60 himself, but reportedly still healthy and content. "He writes occasionally," Thomas said, a mixture of exasperation and affection in his voice. "Brief letters that tell me nothing useful but confirm he's alive. He's the most frustratingly independent person I've ever known, but I've made peace with his choices. If a man has earned the right to live as he pleases, William certainly has." Clara asked Thomas to pass along her regards when next he wrote to William. Thomas smiled. "He mentioned you in his last letter, actually. Said he'd heard the Blackwell house was prospering, and that you'd established some kind of fund to help women in business. He seemed pleased that his judgment about your character had been proven correct." They parted cordially, two people connected by their relationships with a man who had chosen anonymity and isolation, but whose influence extended far beyond his physical presence. Clara returned to Redemption Springs, feeling a sense of satisfaction. Her life had meaning, her work mattered, and the circle that had begun with Webb's intervention in a smoky saloon had completed itself in ways that honored his original gift. The new century arrived with celebrations and optimism. Redemption Springs was now a proper city with paved streets, electric lights, and telephone lines connecting it to the broader world. The Blackwell house had been modernized with indoor plumbing and steam heat, though Clara had been careful to maintain the character and charm that had always defined the establishment. She was now in her 50s, gray-haired, but still energetic, still engaged with her community and her work. The Webb Fund had helped over 100 women by this point, creating a network of female entrepreneurs who supported each other and challenged the assumption that business was exclusively a male domain. Clara took particular pride in these women's successes, seeing in each of them echoes of her own journey from limited options to meaningful agency. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.